Good afternoon, bonjour. Welcome to the second webinar in our series on the future of EU-Africa relations organized by the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. Bienvenue à notre deuxième webinaire de notre série sur les relations entre l'Afrique et l'Union européenne. It's a pleasure for me to open this webinar and to introduce our panelists shortly. But first, please let me start with some technical information. A word on interpretation for our French-speaking guests. Nous offrons l'interprétation anglais-français et vous trouvez le bouton pour choisir entre les deux langues, anglais-français, dans la barre de contrôle ci-dessous. Je vais continuer en anglais maintenant. I'm going to continue in English and would like to introduce my colleague Anne Felmet from the Africa Department of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Berlin. My name is Marco Schwarz and I'm from the FAS EU office in Brussels. Together with Anna, I'm going to moderate the webinar today. Please note that this event will be recorded and we will make it available on our website after the event. You will receive a link via email from us. If you would like to raise questions, you can use the chat feature and we will pick some of your questions later for the discussion. If you would like to ask a question directly, please raise your virtual hand later after the introductory statements from our distinguished panelists. We will then unmute your microphone so we can listen to you and hear your questions. We would already like to remind you to keep your questions and comments short. It's great that we now have about 100 participants in the webinar from across Africa and Europe. We have participants from think tanks, trade unions, NGOs, media, politics, universities from countries such as the Netherlands. We have participants from Zambia, Italy, Tanzania, Belgium, also South Africa, just to mention a few countries. Again, a warm welcome to all guests. If you have a Twitter account, it would be very nice to use the hashtag What's the Offers in your tweets. You can also see it here on my screen. I would like to hand over now to my dear colleague Anna, who will give us more background information on this interesting webinar series.
Well, thank you, Marco, and also welcome from my side to the second webinar in our series. One of the points I took away from the last webinar when we discussed the renewal of the relations between Europe and Africa was that the cooperation needs to be more value-based. And definitely the common effort to support democratic structures and transitions would and probably should be one of those values. So it comes timely that the EU is currently in the process of reforming its external democracy support. However, I think that new approaches on democracy support as well as the partnership in general are strongly linked to the finalization of the new EU instrument for external action, which would be the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument NDICI, where all the existing external action instruments of democracy support will be integrated. That's why today we would like to discuss the implications of NDICI for EU's democracy support in Africa and how all of this fits into the broader picture of the new partnership between the two continents. We will be discussing that with you, the participants, of course, and our panelists, Maria Arena, member of the European Parliament, and John Ikubaye from the African Union Commission. You will hear and see them soon, or well, in a minute. But before that, I would like to ask Nathan van der Putte to give us a short introduction to NDICI and its implications on democracy promotion. Nathan is a researcher at the University of Ghent and had written the policy paper that we circulated as a draft beforehand, so maybe you've already read it. This paper will be finalized after the discussion and of course then sent to you again. Nathan, now the floor, well, the virtual floor would be yours.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm just looking a minute. I hope it is visible right now, my PowerPoint. I want to just present you briefly what is the NDICI.
Sorry, Nathan, I guess the screen is not working. Could you try again, please?
Just let me test this. Screen. I'm sharing my screen. So
yeah, now it's coming.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I just want to briefly introduce to you what is the NDICI, and then also present to you some main findings of my policy brief. Of course, you know, I'll invite you to read it once it will be distributed further. First of all, the NDICI instrument. The NDICI, or the Neighborhood and Development International Cooperation Instrument, is a new external instrument by the European Union, and it will replace the existing funding framework. As such, it promises to be like a radical change compared to previously. For example, it promises more funding, even despite Brexit. It's proposed 11% increase to 89.2 billion euros. It promises more flexibility to be able to adapt more to emerging crisis opportunities. Also simplification. Now there's just one instrument. There won't be, instead of all the previous instruments we had previously, we had the European Development Fund, which was outside the EU budget. We had the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. We had the Development Cooperation Instruments. And so we had a lot of different, but this is all merged into one single instrument. And then finally, also this new instrument promises more transparency. For example, the European Parliament would have gained more insights into this policy making and planning. And the aim of this instrument is to provide a legal framework for aid, which will be implemented between 2021 and 2027. Currently, I must say, it's not really finalized yet. It's still in the legislative phase, which means the European Parliament and the Council are currently discussing in trialogue, they're discussing the Commission proposal. It has been a bit delayed, but hopefully MEP Arena will be able to discuss this further. Basically, it proposes 4 main instruments, which is a geographic instrument, a thematic instrument, rapid response and flexibility. The bulk of financial funding will be delivered to the geographic instruments. The geographic pillar specifically has all the different global regions, and aid here will be prioritized through the principle of ownership, which means all aid developed through this particular pillar will be aligned with partner countries' priorities. First, as you also have a thematic pillar, which is more a global reach. This is more to delve into specific themes like human rights, global challenges. Already we can see the new commission, they promise to become a geopolitical commission to also pursue more the European interests. And as such, we can see that we can see here that the neighborhood and the Sub-Saharan African parts within the geographic pillar will receive most funding, as will the global challenges within the thematic theme, for example, migration related. So what room does this leave for democracy? And this is where my policy brief comes in. Basically, the European Union is bound to support democracy in its external actions as stated in its EU treaty, basically the European Constitution. So since the EU is bound to support democracy, how does this new framework relate to this? How does this new framework allow for democracy to be implemented? In analyzing this, I departed from a bit of an academic angle, concept of legality, which means, in order for something to be legal, it should have, it should be clear on obligation, it should be clear on precision, and should be clear on delegation. Specifically, is democracy sufficiently well defined? Is the external action conditioned upon democratic principles, which is obligation? And who will the EU cooperate with is the delegation. So on the basis of these 3 questions, I have analyzed this document. And then when we look into it, the first part would be, how was democracy framed within the new instrument? Compared to previous EU narrative, we find, for example, in the 2009 Council conclusions on democracy, they emphasized a lot that democracy cannot be imposed from the outside. The 2016 EU Global Strategy also stated that democratic engagement will be decided on a case-by-case scenario. It also came up with a new word, principled pragmatism, which said that the EU principles, for example, democracy, would only be engaged in a more pragmatic way. However, in the new, more recent documents, we can see a bit of a change. First, whereas democracy would be more engaged more proactively, the Council conclusions, the new Council conclusions on democracy, they would emphasize more democratic actors, they would emphasize strengthening political space. In other words, whereas previously there was a lot of emphasis on the external conditions for democracy, stability, etc., the new narrative emphasized much more the core democratic regimes. So the question is, does the NDICI continue this new narrative? And the answer is actually, according to my analysis, no. I find that the new narrative in the NDICI, it refers back to the more external conditions of democracy. So whereas democracy is named as a general principle, it's not really specified. And if it is specified, if it is mentioned, it is not, it's not clear what the priorities are or the indicators are. In fact, amongst the priorities, for example, is gender equality and women's empowerment, but hardly, this this enhances democracy in itself, although it is important for the overall quality of democracy. For example, also indicators which this instrument wants to measure democracy with, refer to the rule of law score, political stability, which again, resembles more the external conditions instead of really continuing on this more political narrative. So with that reality in mind, the question then becomes, how does the NDICI allow for democracy support to be implemented, and then particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa? For this question, I looked at these three instruments, through the geographic pillar, through the thematic, and then rapid response pillars. And then, of course, also as a final one, since civil society and non-state actors are important for overall quality of democracy, how are these actors incorporated? Versus, with regards to the first pillar, the geographic pillar, comes into question the question of ownership. However, who should own democracy? It's not really answered this question. Particularly, ownership risk opening up claims, like a bit more opportunistic claims for non-interference and country sovereignty. However, the EU does not really include any procedures to know what is, local democracy. Also, it does not include any procedures on aid conditionality or aid suspension, which in the end risks for democracy to be degenerated to a game of political bargaining, which may come at the cost of promoting individual and civil societies' rights to autonomy. With regards to the instruments that should favor more flexibility and response to emerging situations, we can also see that the new instrument has also failed to continue a bit does not really live up to the expectations. For example, whereas the EIDHR, the previous instrument for democracy and human rights, really emphasized independence of the instrument, that the instrument could be implemented without the consent of partner governments. Somehow this new NDICI instrument downplays this emphasis through stating that it should be complementary to the geographic instruments rather than, for example, supplementary. So it remains a bit unclear how independent this democracy within thematic programs will be. Also in other instruments, for example, in the rapid response pillar, there's a lot of focus on foreign policy interests, for example, trade, migration, which further can dilute the emphasis on democracy. So whereas we've seen, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of democratic change for the good and for the bad in the past few years, a lot of grassroots movements, it remains unclear how exactly these instruments will adapt, will provide answers to these situations. Finally, the engagement with non-state actors. Again, there's two issues. For one is the issue of funding. A lot of these non-state actors in many countries are very grassroots. They don't really have a lot of expertise on how to manage these EU funding. The EU does not really provide any answers to this question, or the Commission, I should say, the Commission proposal. It's unclear, although the EU mentions, the proposal mentions that, they understand a lot of these actors to be working towards political reform. They also refer to them as, governance actors and more service providers. So there's not really a lot of clarity there either. Basically, then what we can conclude is, although the instrument provides some hope for new policy, it promises flexibility, it promises, but then it doesn't really follow up on its own promises. So basically, you could argue if it's like more old wine in new bottles. Hence, I came up with these recommendations, and these recommendations have been also echoed in a lot of other recent, academic and practitioners' recommendations, is to clarify the non-negotiable principles of democracy, enforce greater compliance, define how supporting democracy is in the EU's strategic interest, clarify how non-state actors and grassroots movements can be a force for political reform, and finally, ring-fence 8 targets for democratic objectives within all components of the NDICI. With this, I hope to have somewhat informed you on this new instrument, and I'm looking forward to the further discussion.
Thank you, Nathan, for this brief and critical introduction into the NDICI or NDICI. And now I have the pleasure to welcome and introduce our two panelists. And I would like to ask Maria Arena and John Ikubaye to turn on the camera, please, so we can see you. Perfect. Maria is our first speaker, and thank you for being with us today. Maria Arena is member of the European Parliament in the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. She is chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights and also a rapporteur for the Socialists and Democrats group on the NDICI. Before she was elected member of parliament, she had several ministerial functions in the Belgian government. And if I'm not mistaken, she just comes from a virtual meeting on the NDICI in the European Parliament. And we are very interested in learning more about the state of play and the recent developments concerning this new financial instrument, in particular when it comes to democracy support in Africa. So how it is going with the NDICI programming would be our first question. And the second point where we would like to hear more from you, it might be is a social democratic perspective on EU's democracy support. So are there any social democratic ideas from your political group on how to shape the future NDICI in a progressive way?
Thank you. I will speak in French if it's okay. Okay, it's easier for me.
Yeah.
Merci.
If you would like to switch on, if you don't understand French, you can now choose at the bottom of your screen, just choose interpretation. Okay, thank you, Maria.
Merci beaucoup pour l'organisation de cet échange, parce qu'on est vraiment au cœur de la discussion sur l'instrument financier, du voisinage, du développement et du soutien effectivement à la politique extérieure aujourd'hui, ce qu'on appelle le NDICI, NDICI si on veut. Nathan a brossé une lecture intéressante de ce qu'il y a aujourd'hui sur la table dans le NDICI. J'ajouterais par rapport à ce que Nathan a expliqué en disant que la réflexion sur la proposition de la Commission sur le NDICI était une recherche de simplification, de flexibilité, de transparence. Ce que nous avons rajouté en tant que Parlement par rapport à la position qui a été prise par le Parlement, qui n'est pas tout à fait celle de la Commission et peut-être encore plus éloignée de celle du Conseil, c'est la question de la prévisibilité. Alors on le sait, aujourd'hui, une partie du NDICI n'est pas dans le budget de l'Union européenne et c'est particulièrement le Fonds européen de développement. Et donc l'objectif est d'intégrer le Fonds européen de développement non plus dans une logique intergouvernementale à la volonté des États membres, mais de l'intégrer dans le budget, donc ce qu'on appelle le MFF aujourd'hui, et donc d'avoir une approche qui est une approche d'une part obligatoire, donc qui n'est plus aléatoire, mais qui en plus, à partir du moment où elle est intégrée dans le budget européen, elle donne automatiquement du pouvoir au Parlement européen, parce que comme vous le savez, par traité, le Parlement européen est celui qui vote et qui contrôle les budgets européens. Donc il y a la question de la prévisibilité, il y a la question de la cohérence des politiques, le fait de mettre tous les instruments qui aujourd'hui sont les instruments de la politique étrangère de l'Union européenne ensemble permet d'avoir une cohérence à l'intérieur de ces politiques. Et enfin, la visibilité. On sait que l'Union européenne, par le biais de ces différents instruments, est un des principaux donateurs par rapport aux pays en développement, mais l'instrument, l'Union, est celui qui est le moins visible en la matière. Et donc, ça permet également de travailler sur la visibilité des instruments européens en la matière. Alors, en ce qui concerne les deux questions qui sont posées par la réunion d'aujourd'hui, à savoir la question des droits de l'homme et de la démocratie et la question plus spécifique de l'Afrique subsaharienne, concernant la question de l'Afrique subsaharienne, je dirais que l'Afrique reste une priorité par rapport aux actions à la fois du NDICI, et on le voit et on l'a vu dans les schémas qui ont été montrés par Nathan, de la partie des pays, de la partie géographique destinée à l'Afrique, qui reste une partie extrêmement importante à l'intérieur de la répartition, mais également au niveau de la thématique sur les droits humains et la démocratie, ça reste également quelque chose d'important qui vient aussi être rajouté sur la question de la réponse rapide, de la flexibilité, dans lesquelles, dans toutes les positions du Parlement européen, la question de la démocratie et des droits humains a été vraiment une ligne, je dirais, qui a été introduite dans l'instrument en tant que tel, qui n'est pas acquise dans la mesure où, d'une part, déjà au niveau du Parlement, on a dû se battre pour que la question de la démocratie et des droits humains apparaisse partout et soit vraiment, comme on l'a dit, respectée parce que les traités nous demandent de le faire. Mais c'est aussi une bataille que nous devrons mener dans les négociations avec le Conseil et avec la Commission pour les trilogues qui vont arriver. Et donc, je dirais que la position du Parlement aujourd'hui privilégie un certain nombre de régions, dont la région Afrique, et un certain nombre de thématiques, dont la thématique des droits de l'homme et de la démocratie. Il faudra qu'on continue à être vigilant en la matière pour pouvoir faire en sorte que la position finale après le trilogue soit bien cette position qui a été présentée par le Parlement. Dernière chose en matière je dirais de transparence, le fait d'intégrer le tout dans le fonds européen, dans l'instrument unique, ça permet également au Parlement européen, et c'est un peu l'échange que le Parlement a fait avec la Commission, d'avoir plus de pouvoir à l'intérieur, je dirais, de la programmation du NDICI, du pouvoir en amont, c'est-à-dire de pouvoir être associé à la programmation qui est mise sur la table par les différentes DG concernées. Donc la programmation en avant, le Parlement aura son mot à dire, c'est ce qu'on appelle les Delegated Acts, et c'est une des raisons pour laquelle quand Nathan dit qu'il y a un certain nombre d'incertitudes par rapport à l'outil, il y a un certain nombre de choses qui devront être faites par des actes délégués, c'est-à-dire des actes qui devront non pas avoir un avis du Parlement, mais devoir avoir un assentiment du Parlement. Et ça me semble extrêmement important en amont, mais également en aval, c'est-à-dire sur les évaluations, les critères d'évaluation des différents programmes qui auront été mis en œuvre et dans lequel nous avons, là aussi, sur les critères d'évaluation, insisté sur la question de la démocratie et des droits de l'homme avec des indicateurs qui sont des indicateurs clés en la matière. Mais là, je pense que le Parlement devra faire une bataille sur ces actes délégués. Je prends un exemple dans d'autres législations, par exemple sur les législations sur le respect de l'environnement, où le Parlement a non pas des actes délégués, mais de la comitologie, c'est-à-dire le Parlement donne des avis, et souvent ces avis ne sont pas respectés par les différentes directions générales de la Commission européenne. Et donc, il nous semble important d'avoir vraiment cette capacité au niveau du Parlement de décider en amont et en aval des différentes programmations. Où en sommes-nous aujourd'hui? Et je terminerai par ça. Vous savez qu'en ce qui concerne les montants, on a parlé des 89 milliards d'euros. En ce qui concerne les montants, nous attendons la décision du MFF, c'est-à-dire la décision sur le budget européen. Vous savez qu'il y a une grosse discussion actuellement sur le budget et donc on est dépendant de cette discussion qui devrait venir avec une nouvelle proposition de la Commission au niveau du MFF qui devrait venir pour la fin du mois de mai. Et donc c'est à ce moment-là qu'on aura des certitudes sur le fait que les différents montants sont garantis. Nous sommes sur cette base alors, nous reprendrons les trilogues politiques qui permettront alors de rentrer dans le vif du sujet. On a des trilogues qui sont des trilogues de plus techniques actuellement, mais la question de l'argent, de la manière dont les moyens vont être attribués est vraiment quelque chose d'extrêmement important. Donc, on pourra rentrer dans des trilogues réellement politiques à partir, je dirais, de la fin du mois de juin pour, et j'espère, terminer pour pouvoir avoir un NDICI finalisé pour la programmation début 2021, parce que comme vous le savez, si nous n'arrivons pas à la programmation début 2021, eh bien ce sont les anciennes modalités qui devront s'appliquer, donc il ne peut pas y avoir de rupture par rapport aux différents opérateurs. Voilà où nous en sommes au niveau des discussions actuellement.
Merci beaucoup, Maria-Arena, pour ce bref commentaire de votre part. I would now like to ask John Ikobaye to turn on his camera. John, can you hear me? Here he is. So perfect. John Ikobaye is a senior political officer for democracy, human rights and elections in the Department of Political Affairs at the African Union Commission. He's taking part from Ethiopia, from Addis at the moment. And we would like to know a bit more from you how democracy promotion in general is seen on the African continent and what's the perception of the EU in Africa. How does EU democracy promotion look like in future? Because so far the programming of NDICI is rather an EU-driven process, but how can, for example, the African Union become an more equal partner in this process?
Yeah, thank you very much, particularly for inviting me and for letting me to be part of this meeting. With regards to your first question on how is EU democracy promotion perceived on the continent, as you all know that the European Union and African Partnership on Democracy Governance, on democratic governance started a long time ago. And the partnership covers different thematic areas. As we all know that there are different forms and types of democracy across the globe, which I will not really go into all the different type of forms. But one thing that is common is that nevertheless, the different types of democracies, there are core universal principles of democracy that we can see in different literatures that are common in virtually all democracies, and which democracy must be anchored on, and some of these factors include regular holding of elections, respect for the rule of law, separation of power, respect for constitution and constitutionalism, respect for electoral laws, and also issues of transparency and accountability which revolve around the issues of good governance. So these, and among other tenets of democracy, are what the European Union has been promoting in Europe and also in Africa. And this values promotion has always been perceived as a welcome development in time of democratic governance on the continent. And so this is how the EU democracy promotion is being perceived on the continent. And let me just give you one brief example. The election observation, which is one of the key supports to the Africa with regards to democracy promotion, you can see that we have been able on the continent to use the outcome of some of this election observation finding and recommendation to further strengthen electoral democracy on the continent. So this as just one example because of time. This is the way the continent has perceived the democracy promotion by the European Union and its effects on the continent. Now, with regards to the EU restructuring of democracy promotion, which factors should be put into consideration? And I think the speakers that spoke first also talk about some of these issues. Some of these factors are already in place. Maybe what we need to do is also to strengthen some of them. Like, for example, stakeholders' definition of democracy initiatives. And this talk about, the African citizens being at the driver's seat, defining democracy initiatives that the European Union will be supporting in time of programs and initiatives. Also, that the beneficiaries of the support really owns the process. In other words, beneficiaries' ownership of democratic initiative that the European Union will be also supporting. Also, it is also very fundamental that this factor is also put into consideration, that the citizens also participate in implementing different democratic initiatives that the European Union will be supporting, and also that they participate in evaluation of the impacts of the support that the European Union will be providing. In also other things that also need to be taken into consideration. If you look at it, the support by the European Union has more or less focused at the national level. We need to begin to think of how to strengthen, local governance, local democracy. It is by so doing that we will be able to overcome so many challenges that are confronting the democracy and governance on the continent. And in addition to some of these factors, I think there are also needs for us to include some novel initiative, like, for example, support implementation of democracy and governance norms. Like some of you may be aware that the African Union has what is popularly known as an African Charter on Democracy, Election, and Governance. This is more or less the norms that guide the entire promotion of democracy under the African governance architecture on the continent. And so emphasis must be placed on implementations of these provisions in this charter. And so it is very important that we emphasize implementation. Now, other initiative that will be important is also things like e-governance, in democracy, as this will help to reduce and also address some of the challenges that are confronting our democratic governance on the continent. Like, for example, it will help to reduce issues of corruption and also deepen transparency and accountability, issues of innovative leadership, and also issues of judiciary and election petition, as some of you may be aware. This is one of the things that is becoming a serious challenge on the continent with regard to our democracy, where we have seen instances where the judiciary eventually we come with a conclusions that contradicts the electoral vote decision at the end of the day. So these are some of the areas that needs to be addressed. So far, the program, let me also come to the program of NDICI, whether rather an EU process. It is rather an EU process. How can the African Union be equal partners in this process? Well, let me just first start on this note to indicate that there are principles that guide the African Union and European Union relationship. And some of these principles include equality in partnership, mutual respect, consultation, and consensus building. And it is also important to emphasize that neither the EU nor the AU is a junior partner in AU and EU partnership. And let me just give you one example, for example, which underscored the point that I have made now. The 10th commission to commissions meeting. What we refer to as commission meeting is where the African Union Commission and the European Union Commission come together to brainstorm on the way forward. And this, the 10th commission to commission meeting was held at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa on the 27th of February 2020. And I happen to have participated in the Peace, Security and Governance cluster, which addressed the issues of democracy, human rights, and other related governance issues. And virtually all issues were discussed, including the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. And maybe I also make this known too, that currently the African Union and also the European Union are currently finalizing a joint agreement document on how they will work together on different thematic areas. It's not only on democratic governance, but issues of climate change, issues of peace and security, and so many other issues. So what we are currently working on now is developing what we refer to as the instruments that will help us to guide how the European Union and the African Union will be working together. But on particular, with regards to the democracy promotion, we have that component and we are currently developing. The European Union have drafted that document and it was sent to us to make input. And so the stage where we are now is working on this document to make our own input into it and to finalize it, so that at the end of the day, it will now be one document that is owned by the two unions to help in promoting and supporting deepening democratization on the continent.
Thank you very much, John, for this short input, and also Maria again for the input. We'll now start the discussion. So Maria, feel free to come back on the panel and turn your video on. We just heard you have to leave a bit earlier, so we'll maybe start posing some questions to you before you have to leave us. So I have I have two questions here which I'm going to pose you. First would be on the current process on NDICI, which you just pictured to us, how will that all fit into the broader picture of the renewal of the relations between Europe and Africa? John has already mentioned the strategy. There's the EU summit coming up. We still have discussions on the continuation or on the Cotonou agreement. So how does NDICI and the discussions on that fit in there? Maybe that is one question. And then I have a question from the chat from our previous webinar from last week, which was, well, I'll just read it out. In previous versions of the EU-Africa partnership, cooperation and dialogue on democratic governance has proven to be limited, strained, and gradually pushed to the margins. What lessons can be learned from previous experience to set out a more strategic approach to counter democratic backsliding, attacks on the rule of law and closing civic space? Maybe I leave it with those two questions to you. If that would be possible for you, it would be great if you could answer in English, since we're having some troubles with the interpretations. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So thank you. For the first question, so what I said is NDICI is a kind of framework that we have. You have a financial instrument, you have a regional place, you have the thematic issues, and you have criteria. When it comes to the strategy for the relationship between EU and Africa, it will be in another place that we will discuss about that. And this is the EU strategy for Africa. And it is now discussed between EU and African Union, but it is also discussed here at the European Parliament. We have a proposal and we will make our statement here coming from the Parliament. And this strategy decided between both actors will be a framework for the NDC. So it is not something, it has to be coherent, but what will be decided for the EU-Africa strategy will be put in the NDICI instrument. And it is in the delegated act as Parliament that we will have to manage the NDICI and the strategy that we have to respect after discussion that we will have with our counterpart in Africa. So it's really important to understand that these two different mechanisms, these two different instruments will have to be merged together and work together for the future. And this is really important for us. For the second question, I will say that in the NDICI, we took as a parliamentary position the Cotonou Agreement as an example. And for example, we put in an NDICI the capacity to use what we have in the Article 96, if I remember well, the sanction mechanism in the Cotonou Agreement, to say that it's possible to have a sanction mechanism in our NDICI as the Parliament. And we have to take the positive mechanism that we have in the Cotonou Agreement and other agreements, not only in the Cotonou Agreement, and to put it in the NDICI system. We need to have this sanction mechanism in a tool like NDICI. Without this, it will be very difficult to make democracy and human rights a priority. Because as you know, in the geopolitical way, you always have people saying that there is more important than democracy. And some people saying that with trade, for example, we will have democracy. And so they said that it is not important to have democracy at the beginning because they will have democracy in the end. And sometimes it doesn't work. And we have a lot of trade agreements with some countries. They have trade, we have trade, but there is no democracy, and it is worsening in some countries. So for us, it's really important to have this criteria on democracy and human rights, really one that you can stop an agreement, you can stop a financial mechanism because of the non-respecting of democracy and human rights. And this is really important. And finally, I must say that NDICI is not it is the financial instrument, but it is not the only instrument that we have at the European Union level to make partnership with countries. We have a lot of instruments and we have to shape them with this criteria of democracy. I spoke about trade. You know that I'm totally against this trade agreement that we have had in negotiation with Africa for the moment, because they are not respecting no democracy, neither human rights. And it is not the purpose of these trade agreements. The purpose of these trade agreements for Europe is to have access to the African markets. They don't care about human rights. And so I think that, of course, we have to shape these NDICI with democracy criteria, but we also have to shape other tools that we have to guarantee that democracy is important. And it is why I said that the new strategy for Africa can't just be trade. If it is trade, we will lose our leverage to have democracy. So it's really important to continue to have trade and democracy together, because without that, you will have trade, but never you will have democracy.
Thank you very much for your answer. Maybe one question back to you, and then John will, of course, come to you with questions as well. We had on the thread quite a number on questions on civil society participation and inclusion, and Nathan also raised this in his introduction. John mentioned it. So maybe not only civil society organizations, how are they included, how are they tackled, but also other non-state actors, mentioning in trade unions, media, political parties. So how are they included in the NDICI? Yeah, maybe you can say a couple of words on that.
They are clearly part of the NDICI. So we have in the NDICI non-state actors as a priority. So it is really important to work with them. You know that we have the budgets, I don't know how to say that in English, l'approche budgétaire in the NDICI, and it is with government that we have to work with, and it is important to have this ownership with government. But it is also important to have and to support this non-governmental actors in different cases, even when it is, we have a very nice partnership with government, we know that it's important to have these non-governmental actors in countries. But it is also, and more important, when we have difficulties with the government, to guarantee that there is a vibrant civil society in a country, because it is with civil society that we can touch the population in some areas. So it is really important to continue with that. And we also, and we have this discussion for the moment, to work with the local authority also, because sometimes it's a so centralized system in some countries that it is better to work with the local authorities and not with the government authorities also. So it is also something that we have to have in the NDC. It is not easy to win this battle, because a lot of people are saying, no, if it's governmental, it is the national one and not the local one. And we are dealing with the fact that we need to have also this partnership with civil society and local authority also in countries.
Maybe also to John Ikubai, if you would like also to have some remarks here. Otherwise, we could also take some questions now from the audience. But John, please, first.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like I said during my remarks, that for us, one of the principles of the African Union is also for the continent to speak with one voice. That is the reason why you see that the African Union engagement and interaction with the European Union is being coordinated under the African Union Commission. And we also have other platforms like the one that happened last year, where the head of states comes together to discuss issues of agreement with regards to governance and also in other areas. But like I said, for example, the African Union just adopted a charter on local governance, democracy, local governance. So the issues of citizens' participations in governance, particularly at the local level, is of high importance for us at the African Union, and we are really pushing for that with regards to our discussion with our partners. And also the second issue has to do with the civil society participation. For us, we, like you know, that we do have a CIDO, a directorate dealing with the civil society involvement in African Union process in all activities and programs. And so the issues of civil society participation, because you can't talk about a legitimate governance, without citizens' participation. And from our experience at the African Union, we realized that the civil society play critical roles, even at some level where some decision has been taken, like Maria did say that maybe there are some challenges in areas of democracy, human rights respect, and all the rest of them. We have seen a constructive roles that the civil society has played, partnering with the African Union to actually push the member states to adhere to some of these democratic norms and principles, and also respect for human rights. So citizens' participation and also the civil society participation is very fundamental in the work that we do also at the African Union.
So thank you very much. We now would like to take some questions from the floor. And we have a first question. Now you can raise your hand if you like, but we have a first question by Glenn Falk from the Southern African Unity Council of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Is Glenn here? This doesn't work at the moment. We take...
Yeah, well, he's there, Marco.
Hi.
His picture's there. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, we hear you. Thank you, Clem, for joining.
Good. Thank you, Marco. And thank you to Maria and John. I think that some of the key issues have already been highlighted in the interactions so far. From the point of view of civil society in Southern Africa, I think one of the key issues is, while we would very much favor clear indicators within the framework, and that be linked to into a indigenization process, it is clear that we need to work strongly at regional level to support what is happening at the African Union and also what is happening within member states. So the regional economic communities within Africa actually allow for the flexibility that is necessary to actually be realized. So we also want to pose the question of these AU-EU interactions and the degree or the extent to which instruments such as the AGDEG, which member states in Africa, for example, signed on to, are going to help guide and be embedded. The African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance is an agreed instrument. It exists. In these partnerships, can we ensure that they are also embedded? So I suppose the question is, from our side, is twofold. One, with limited resources, and these resources are limited, how do we ensure optimal impact within the African Union architecture, and within that, what is the role for the regional economic communities? Then I think, secondly, the challenges that we have with fencing. We do believe that rather than approach the instrument as a single once-off action, where are the pause points that allow for participation? So when we come to ring fencing, if we take the SADC, for example, we understand that there are already commitments that exist, but it's very difficult to open up that space to have the dialogue, so that when actions are taken, they're perceived to be either be taken from the EU side, or they are being taken by member states. So the periodic review of the program is not so much one that is about ticking a box or an accounting exercise, but it is a deepening democratic participation exercise. So are there spaces going to be created where dialogue can exist between stakeholders and the European Union, and include member states and civil society in that, to have constructive dialogue on progress, so that we don't go through the program after several years or find that indicators are not met, and then the perception exists that there's unilateral action, or that there's opaqueness on the part of member states and a lack of transparency with civil society when we develop the...
Thank you for the point you raised, but since Maria has really to leave in 5 minutes and we want to take another question, I thank you for your remarks and the question. So we would like to take a second question now before Maria unfortunately has to leave us because she has another meeting in the European Parliament. The second question will be from Adelaide from the ACP Young Professionals Network. Can we please have her open her mic and then we can listen to her question. The colleague is trying to connect. Here she is. So just unmute your microphone and now I guess we can hear you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello.
Hello. Yeah, we hear you. Please raise your question.
Well, thank you for the intervention from all panelists. So my question really is, there's been an effort to include diaspora civil society organization. And I guess it links up to the other question from the other civil society organizations. So how and what is the role of the civil society diaspora organizations in this process? And yeah, so how are they going to be defined basically?
Thank you, perfect. So I will give the floor to Maria Arena for her final words and to John. Maria, please.
Thank you. I wanted to speak about the ACP Joint Parliamentary Assembly when it comes to try to have an exchange between EU and Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. I'm in the ACP Joint Parliamentary Assembly, and we noted there that there is a huge difference between the way we are functioning at the European level as member of the ACP and the way African parliamentary are informed in Africa about the different programs that we have together. And I think there is something to do there for more democracy. In Africa, we see that there is an executive power without having a discussion with the parliament. And we need to have more information to the parliament to give them all the information they need to go to the population and to have the consent of the population when it comes to some programs. So I think there is something there to use, and it is why we said that in the post-Cotonou, we need to continue to work with this joint parliamentary assembly and to have this link between parliament from the European Union and parliament from different African countries. And we can learn a lot about the different challenges that we have in common, the common challenges that we have between Africa and Europe. And it is really interesting to work there and to have more information to share. What about the diaspora? I work a lot with the diaspora civil society. For example, now I'm working on the Cameroon situation and how we have to deal with this Anglophone crisis that we have in Cameroon, and how is it possible to help the diaspora because we know that there is a lot of Anglophone diaspora in Europe and all over the world. So it is important to work with this diaspora. There is nothing really written in the NDICI on diaspora civil society, but I think that at the European level, we know that working with this diaspora, it is two ways of working with them. It is to give them the recognition at the European level. They are European citizens. They have the European citizenship. Though it is important to work with them as European, being informed of what their country is living in Africa. So it is important in this side to work with the diaspora because they are European one, but it is also important to work with them in relationship with Africa because they can have some leverage in the country from where they are from. So for me, it's really important to work with them, but it is not written in the NDICI mechanism for the moment as such. But you have your place there. You have your yeah. You can work in the NDICI, of course.
Thank you, Maria. So, John, would you also like to join, please?
I have to.
Please unmute your microphone.
Okay. Yeah, it's unmuted.
Yeah.
Let me first start where Maria raised the issue of where there is no discussion with the parliament by the executive. I think it is important to know that to understand Africa properly, and also to know that we have 55 African countries, and that the level of democratic development differs. And so to generalize like that might not really hold water. So there are some developed democracies where discussion actually take place between the executive and the legislature. So this type of generic conclusion may not really be the situation in all the countries on the continent. Having said that, with regards to the roles of CSO in the discussion, under the African Union structures or mechanism, there are different platforms where the civil society can actually play a critical role in supporting and also engage in this process. The first one is the directorates, which is known as CIDO for the ECOSOC, where the civil society, they have civil society network that are members, and they can also use that approach to engage in the process. The second one, and maybe some of you may be aware, is the EU-AUCSO platform. Under this platform, there are different issues that do come up. The issues of human rights, the issues of democracy and governance come up as thematic issues for discussion. And we have serious engagement with the Secretariat of the AU, the EU Secretariat, liaison office to the African Union. We work together on this, on how the civil society gets involved in this process. So before any discussion at the political level between the AU and EU, the civil society are also given the opportunity to have their own discussion and their own position. And this position will be presented to the political, the political organs for consideration. So there are rooms. And in addition to that, you will also see one of the lessons that we are currently learning is the Gambia experience, where we have seen the CSOs in diaspora making constructive inputs, contributions to the democratization in countries like the Gambia. And those are the type of network that we continue to encourage and also to work with as African Union for them to be able to make their constructive contribution into the issues like transitional justice, the National Human Rights Commission. We have seen the CSO in diaspora making contribution. So we are able to engage all this process and also support these CSOs in diaspora. Finally, with regards to the issues that was raised by my brother from South Africa, with regards to the role of putting into consideration the instrument. If there is going to be any support by the European Union with regard to deepening democratization on the continent, and the ACDEC, which is the African Charter on Democracy, Governance and Election, if they are not put into consideration, then there will be question of legitimacy in the support of democratization on the continent. And that is the reason why the engagement and the discussion that is currently going on between the African Union and European Union with regard to different programs that is being supported, the draft document that we are considering, we are also reviewing the agreement that has been drafted at the technical level, and we are considering some of the instruments that will be relevant to deepening the programs in different areas that they are considering. So ACDEC is one of the things that must be included in the partnership agreement for the democratization to be seriously deepened in the agreement between the African Union and the European Union in support to democracy at the national level in our member states. I think I will just stop at that level.
Thank you, John. And well, as you've probably seen, Marina Arena had to leave us, but fortunately we have Nathan on the panel again, who is, well, as he's already proved, an expert on the instrument. So we'll continue the discussion, of course. I picked two questions from the chat, which go a bit in the direction of the implications the current corona pandemic has, because of course this will have impacts on the processes going on as well. One question is on the electoral cycles in Africa. The question was, on the one hand, what could the European Union do to support electoral cycles in Africa, apart from election monitoring missions? So, and especially since in some countries we see quite some impacts of corona on electoral cycles. So maybe, John, you could go a bit in the direction of what impacts does corona have on elections or on democracy in general, and maybe what could the AU and also the EU do, and maybe Nathan, you have some ideas on that as well. And the second question is also concerning implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the question whether we'll see a shift to health and economic recovery away from democratic support. So do you see that threat or change, maybe? I don't know, Nathan, would you like to answer or share your thoughts?
Yes, I could maybe share some thoughts. Maybe to start with the second question, if you can see maybe a shift to more health and other emerging, just more other interests other than democracy. Currently, the NDICI is still not really finalized, and it's the Parliament versus the also the European Council. Basically, whereas the European Parliament already has come up with some conclusions on or a position on the NDICI, there's a lot of questions still going on within the European Council and the member states. And so if this, corona implications, it will probably have to do a lot with the member states. Already, as we have seen in the past, the longer the negotiations last between member states, the more democracy, in any case, loses interest. So with regards to the second question, yes, I would see maybe the democracy losing, interest as to these interests. On a different note, maybe, even NDICI will, the coronavirus will result in, further delay on the agreement of NDICI, and then already there've been some discussions on maybe finding a plan B, just for like an intermediary solution, intermediary budget, just to cover the year 2001, just in the beginning, before the actual NDICI instrument can start. With regards to the electoral cycles, of course, it's a global phenomenon where we see that, the COVID-19 authoritarianism, if I can put it that way, is on the rise. There's a lot more pressure on public space and civic space. So I don't think the elections itself is at the point of to be emphasized here. It's more the period, like the time in between elections, which should be emphasized. And already I think the EU has made that switch, whereas previously it focused a lot on elections, but nowadays it focuses much more on the time in between elections, and I think that is the way to go, especially during COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Then maybe moving to you, John. Would you like to share some thoughts? You need to unmute yourself. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so thank you very much. The impact of coronavirus, globally is going to be devastating, and particularly in Africa, as we realize that, even some country has to slash down their national budget because of the effect and the impact of coronavirus. And so many countries, are naturally natural resources dependent countries, like for example, some of them on crude oil, and the impact, the current situation with regards to crude oil and all the rest of them. So as a result of this, together with other factors, some countries have to reduce, their national budget, which they have agreed upon before. So the impact of coronavirus is huge. Not only that at the national level, when you look at the effect, the impact on the small scale business, particularly, the informal economy on the continent, where huge percentage of the population rely on daily income, like for example, a taxi driver, somebody that sells small market and all the rest of them, they depend daily, they make their income on a daily basis. And for them to be under to be locked down for months, this has serious impact. And so we are beginning to see a situation where people are now saying that, that a hunger virus is more dangerous than coronavirus. And so these are serious challenge on the continent that we are currently grappling with, and which some countries are beginning to, use initiative to see how to address the challenge of lockdown and to open the economy so that at least individuals can go out and also see how they can make ends meet, in addition to the economic initiative that the government has put in place to address the challenges. So the challenges is really huge, and it's going to be huge even after the coronavirus phase. The second issue has to do with the impact with regard to electoral circles. Now, there are some countries that has postponed their election because of the coronavirus. Some are saying that they will go ahead to organize their election, but reasonable numbers of the African Union members has concluded that they are going to postpone their election because of the coronavirus. So these are some of the impact that the coronavirus is having on the electoral circle on the continent. In addition to that, what can the European Union support or partner with the African Union member states in time of strengthening the electoral governance on the continent? We realize that one of the areas that the European Union has been able to make a lot of impact has to do with this election observation. But election goes beyond just election observation, and support should go beyond just election observation. If some of you that are familiar with the European Union election observation, and even including the African Union election observation, there are always the aspect that deals with recommendations on how to improve in future elections, what needs to be done. And that is the area that I see that we have not been able to do a lot in that areas, where technical assistance provided to support member states to follow up on some of these recommendations. Recommendation for recommendation's sake will not make any impact. So I think there is a need to focus more on strengthening, on supporting African Union member states in the areas of recommendation. In addition to that, there are other issues in the electoral circle, like, for example, promoting internal democracy among the political parties. These are some of the things that, assistance could be provided for member states to strengthen their national political parties, and also some of the National Electoral Commission are not, carrying out their role the way they're supposed to. We could support, our partnership could bring about support, in the areas of electoral risk assessment management. These are areas that, we can also support in our agreement in addition to election observation. So there are so many areas, particularly when you look at the recommendations on the election. We need to focus more in our partnership to address those recommendations in the AU and EU election observation report for us to be able to overcome some of the challenges in electoral circles on the continent.
Thank you very much, both of you, for sharing your insights on election observation, but also the electoral cycles affected, of course, by the corona pandemic. And we would like to take in 2 more questions from the floor. And the first one would be from Alexandros Bachis from the European Business Council for Africa. So, Alexandros, are you here? Okay, unmute your microphone. Yeah, now it seems to work. We can hear you. No, unfortunately we can't hear you. No, sorry. Maybe we try in a minute. We have, and there's one more question from the audience from Vince Chadwick, I guess. Yeah, maybe take this question. Now, Alexandros, now we have your picture. Now we only need to hear you. Maybe we try Vince Chadwick, we'll raise his hand, and then we see if it works with Alexandros later.
Hi.
Perfect. Yeah, we hear you, see you.
Great. Thanks for this. I have a question about the Cotonou negotiations. And I was interested in Maria's comments about replicating Article 96 in the NDICI agreement. I guess my question is, we've already got Article 96 and countless hours have been spent negotiating a Cotonou agreement between the EU and there's an African pillar of that agreement. I'd be interested for the panel's thoughts on any potential duplication and whether we've got an unnecessary parallel process going on and whether that dilutes the power of what we're trying to achieve when we talk about human rights in this relationship. Thanks.
Thank you. And could you also tell us the organization you represent? We haven't heard this.
Yeah, I'm a journalist with devex.com.
Thank you. We can try again. Alexandros, I tried to unmute your microphone. Alexandros, are you here? Otherwise, no, sorry, it doesn't seem to work. I'm sorry. So we will, the one question I will start with Nathan and then John.
Well, thank you very much. As to the Article 96 on aid suspension, maybe like three points to this answer. Of course, Article 96 is particularly within the Cotonou agreements, but maybe 4 points to this answer. The Of course, for one, the Cotonou Agreement is coming to an end, and so this is the completely different discussions. So basically, Cotonou should be replaced by the new partnership with Africa, but then this goes simultaneously with the NDICI negotiations. So I guess currently Article 96 isn't really in place because it's being changed. So I think it could be incorporated into the NDICI. Also, of course, the NDICI is much broader than Africa alone, and I think there should be within the general instruments some some conditionality on democracy support, so much broader than Africa, that states the the grounds on which aid should be suspended, but also the procedures, because I think it should just be about suspension, but the aid should continue maybe through other means, through non-state actors, etc. Another issue is, of course, also that changed with previously is the budgetization of the EDF. Previously, also much of the current ACP countries under the Cotonou Agreement, they also get their funding through the EDF, but this was outside of the budget. So with the new instrument, which proposes a one single instrument, including the budgetization of the EDF, I think again there should be an argument for more conditionality, because it's there's more aid, there's especially also since the new instrument wants to copy a lot of the benefits of the EDF, such as the transfer of funding, etc., etc. And then there's this final point, and this is what I tried to argue in my policy brief. When you look at the concept of legality, if you want to have clarity, there should be this one issue of conditionality. There should be clarity on what on grounds of when you don't answer to the terms of the agreement.
So it seems, John, are you still here? Okay, that seems to be, please unmute. Perfect, here you go.
Yes. Well, with regards to the article that was referred, the Cotonou Agreement on Article 96, well, discussion is still ongoing at the levels of the African Union with regards to how to address the challenge. And also mind you that we do have the AU and EU human rights dialogue and other dialogue. And so these issues, we are still working towards having that meeting very soon. And so those are some of the issues that we are also deliberating upon. But having said that, the issues of conditionalities, we have realized that the African Union also has some instruments, whether it be on issues of democracy or issues of human rights. And our argument and our position is that if there's going to be any conditionality outside with regard to our different, agreement, that our instruments, the African Union instrument, the African instruments that are progressive in nature should be used as conditionalities. Like, for example, we have instruments like the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. This instrument, and we also have the African Charter on people's on humans and people's rights. There are good provisions in these articles that was agreed upon, that the provisions in these articles, in this instrument, could be used as conditionalities, in meeting some of the requirements of member states. These are instruments that they have ratified and also agree upon. So the argument is that we are looking inwards, looking at human rights, good governance instruments that can be used as conditionality to hold accountable some of the African Union member states for them to be able to meet the requirements that was agreed upon. But meanwhile, discussion is still ongoing on these particular issues, and I will not be able to say in concrete time this is the conclusion of the AU on with regards to that.
Thank you, John. We'll have two final questions. We'll have a mixture here now from a chat question and the video question. So we'll pick Luis Muape for the video question. You can already start coming in, Luis, and I'll post the chat question meanwhile. Well, it's concerning flexibility. EU democracy support instruments have been sometimes criticized for not being flexible or fast enough, especially when we see democratic transformations going on the African continent, as we've seen it during the last couple of years. And we have a window of opportunity. The EU is often too rigid to answer or support that. So is that, Nathan, question to you, is that included now in NDICI? Are there approaches for more flexibility, and how do we judge them? And John, what do you think, what should be approaches for the European Union to be more flexible and support democratic transitions? So that's maybe the chat question, and we'll continue with Luis' question. Luis, are you there? Can you unmute yourself? Yes, go ahead with your question and maybe introduce yourself shortly. And please try to make it short since we're running out of time.
Yes, thank you very much. Are you able to get me?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the questions has already been tackled, but I think I have one question on the Africa Charter on the democracy and governance. My question goes to John, and it is more about democratization of the Charter. Because what we have, I happen to be one of the president for SADC CNGO, where Grain was coming from, is that the Charter is not popular on the ground. It's not placed in the citizens' domain. So how do you, as African Union, signed up on the Charter? And then on the second question is on the CEDAW. We find that the CEDAW for many
Luis, sorry, there seems to be
civil society organizations
problems
in Africa have challenges to be.
There seem to be problems with the audio. I think we'll just take the question as far as we got it, and if not, go to the flexibility questions. And maybe, short final statements from you, John and Nathan. Please try to make it short since we only have a couple of minutes left. Maybe Nathan, you first, and then we give John the final word from the panel.
Yes, thank you. So just on the flexibility question, supposedly there should be 3 instruments for this increased flexibility. It's the rapid response pillar, the cushion for emerging priorities, and then we have the thematic instruments for democracy and human rights. However, that being said, there is, I find, the NDICI document talks a lot about, challenges, not democratic challenges as such. They talk more about the migration and other challenges, but they don't really mention opportunities. So basically, they take a more negative approach to, for example, these democratic challenges we've seen in many countries in Africa, like the closing space and all that, but they don't really address opportunities such as grassroots movements we've seen, for example, in Sudan or Zimbabwe or other places. Then there's also the issue of the transfer of money. The instrument indicates that a specific amount should be left unallocated within each instrument, without really stating that democracy should have specific thresholds. Basically, it could be that but the budget will be transferred to other priorities such as trade, even what we see now with COVID-19. Also, in my analysis, whereas the global strategy, and this is the final point, mentions that the EU should focus on its priorities, which is its borders. There's a lot of priority on, for example, the immediate neighborhood, but then the global strategy mentions that engagement further afield should be done on a case-by-case analysis, and also there's the concept of principled pragmatism. Basically, the further afield, the further, for example, the EU would really reconsider if it wants to engage in, in these democratic challenges or opportunities. So in my analysis, the current document doesn't really provide sufficient answers or guarantees that that the EU will engage in these democratic, or will be flexible to answer these democratic challenges.
Thank you, Nathan. Maybe then over to you, John, for short final words. You're not yet unmuted. Oh, John, unmute yourself first, please.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
It's been controlled from your end there. With regards to the issues of flexibility, I think those are some of the issues that will be addressed by the consultation that is currently going on. Like, as I told you, that we have some of this document, and we are also at the level of the African Union, we have our own reservation with regard to some of the provisions in the document. And we are doing our own consultation at the technical level, and which will be finalized and also forwarded to the political level for approval, which will be then sent to European Union for consideration and acceptance. So I think this process-led approach with regards to finalizing this instrument will help us to address challenges, including many challenges that we have encountered before, including the issues of flexibility. I think this is just the few words that I can say with regard to the question of flexibility.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, and of course also to Maria Arena, who's already left. I think, well, there were quite a number of very interesting points in the discussion. What I am taking away, or what I like very much, is how you, John, stressed that it has to be an equal partnership. And I like very much how Maria stressed that it has to be coherent with the other instruments and well, strategies or processes being developed. So we'll definitely, as FES, watch NDICI further. And well, next week in our webinar, we'll focus on a different finance instrument, the EU External Investment Plan. Our webinar will be next Tuesday at 2 p.m. again. Well, not again as today, but again as last week. You will receive an invitation from us shortly. You will also receive Nathan's paper finalized. You will also receive a link of our today's webinar, which also will be available on our website shortly. Thank you very much for your participation also in the chat. We'll go through the chat and try to include all those questions that unfortunately couldn't be answered today in the upcoming webinars. Thank you, John, thank you, Nathan, for your participation. Thanks to our interpreters, thanks to the technical support, and we're hoping to see you again next week. Take care, bye-bye.